Every 2 years in America, a strange ritual begins. A ritual where normal people suddenly become steel workers from Ohio, church-going family men from Texas, urban reformers from New York, environmentalists from California, and defenders of freedom from literally everywhere, all at the same time. A ritual where a 74-year-old millionaire who owns 3 houses suddenly puts on blue jeans, walks into dinner, grabs a hat, and tells you that he understands the struggles of the common man, and perhaps most importantly, a ritual where politicians promise literally everything. Lower taxes, more jobs, better healthcare, less spending, more spending, stronger borders, open opportunities, cheaper gas, cleaner energy, world peace, and economic growth. And in some cases, apparently free money for everyone with a pulse. Now, to be fair, some politicians genuinely believe the things they say. But the problem is that the campaign process itself rewards people who are able to socially shapeshift depending on who they are talking to. Because in America, winning elections is not just about having good ideas. It's about surviving one of the most expensive and psychologically manipulative marketing competitions on planet Earth. So today, let me explain why politicians promise everything during campaigns. When most people think about political campaigns, they imagine speeches, debates, rallies, and maybe a few ads. But modern campaigns are closer to corporations than movements. Entire organizations made up of consultants, strategists, media teams, pollsters, donors, data analysts, influencers, lobbyists, volunteers, and public relations experts, all working together to sell one product, the candidate. And like every other product in America, the candidate must be branded. The average campaign for a United States House seat costs around $2 million. A Senate campaign can easily surpass $20 to $100 million depending on the state. And presidential campaigns? Those things consume money like a black hole consuming light. The 2020 election cycle reportedly cost around $14 billion. $14 billion. At that point, you are not running a democratic process anymore. You are basically producing Avengers Endgame with more flags. Now, where does all this money come from? Well, officially, campaigns receive money through donations. Individuals donate. Political action committees donate. Corporations indirectly influence funding. Wealthy individuals host fundraising dinners where politicians pretend to care about shrimp cocktails while quietly asking for $50,000. And then there's super PACs. One of the greatest legal inventions ever created for people who wanted to influence politics while pretending they are technically not coordinating with campaigns. After the Citizens United Supreme Court case in 2010, independent political spending exploded, which means wealthy groups can spend enormous amounts of money supporting candidates as long as they are not officially coordinating with them. Which is kind of like me hiring my cousin to scream compliments about me outside your house while insisting I have absolutely nothing to do with it. The result is that modern campaigns are less about convincing people and more about strategically targeting specific emotional groups, which brings up the actual campaign cycle itself. The primary election is where politicians become ideological extremists, because during the primary, you are not trying to appeal to the entire country. You are trying to appeal to the most politically active members of your own party. These are the people who donate, volunteer, attend rallies, argue online at 2 a.m., and treat political ideology like a religion. So candidates naturally shift towards the desires of these groups. A Republican candidate may become aggressively anti-establishment, hyper-patriotic, and intensely focused on immigration, taxes, and cultural issues. The Democratic candidate may emphasize climate policies, healthcare expansion, labor rights, student debt relief, and social justice. Notice something though. During this phase, compromise is death. Nuance is death. Saying the issue is complicated is political suicide. The incentives reward certainty, even if reality itself is uncertain. And one politician who mastered this process incredibly well was Donald Trump. Now, regardless about how you personally feel about him, you cannot deny that Trump understood political signaling better than almost anyone in modern American politics. In the 2016 Republican primary, Trump positioned himself as the anti-establishment outsider. He attacked traditional Republicans, mocked political correctness, framed himself as a billionaire who could not be bought despite being a billionaire, which ironically made many people trust him more. The hats, the rallies, the direct language, the constant conflict, everything about the campaign was built around emotional signaling. He signaled strength, dominance, wealth, national identity, and most importantly, rebellion against institutions. Now compare this to Bernie Sanders during the Democratic primaries. Bernie leaned heavily into anti-corporate messaging, free colleges, universal healthcare, attacks on billionaires, attacks on pharmaceutical companies, attacks on wealth inequality. And visually, Bernie signaled authenticity, wrinkled suits, unpolished speeches, large energetic crowds, a Brooklyn accent, the aesthetic of a man who looks like he just walked out of a university economics lecture after arguing with 3 administrators and a vending machine. Both Donald Trump and Bernie understood something important. Primary voters do not want moderation. They want emotional conviction. They want a fighter, even if the actual policy details are vague. And because these voters are more ideologically intense, politicians are incentivized to make larger promises and more absolute statements than they realistically could achieve once in office. Once the primary is over, something magical happens. And the same candidates who spend 6 months screaming ideological purity suddenly become moderates. Now, instead of appealing to the most politically engaged people, you must appeal to suburban parents, undecided voters, moderates, independents, and politically exhausted citizens who just want society to stop feeling like a Twitter argument. This shift is practically explained through something called the median voter theorem, a political theory that basically argues that in a two-party system, politicians naturally drift towards the average voter in the middle because that is where the largest pool of persuadable people are. Think about it like this. If one candidate appears only to be far left, another only appears to be far right, then whoever captures the exhausted normal guy in the middle who just wants affordable groceries and functional roads probably wins. So after primaries, candidates begin softening themselves. This stage is where campaigns become incredibly calculated. Posters, tests, phrases, advertisements, and focus groups. Speechwriters carefully removing controversial wording. Campaign teams analyzing voter behavior down to the zip code. And social signaling becoming even more important. A great example of this is Barack Obama during the 2008 general election. During the Democratic primary, Obama positioned himself as a progressive reform candidate focused on ending the Iraq War and pushing structural political change. But during the general election, his message became broader and more emotionally universal. Hope, unity, national healing, economic recovery. Notice how these are themes that anyone could project onto themselves. And visually, Obama's campaign was incredibly disciplined. Large, optimistic rallies, perfectly framed speeches, clear branding, professional typography, and the famous blue and red O logo. Everything signaled competence, calmness, and modernity. At the same time, John McCain attempted to signal experience, patriotism, and stability. An older military veteran, more traditional, more restrained, the campaigns were not just selling policies. They were selling emotional identity, and social identity becomes even more important. You will notice candidates suddenly visiting factories, churches, border towns, black neighborhoods, college campuses, military bases, union halls, small businesses. The goal is not merely policy decisions. The goal is visual association. The politician must become a symbolic mirror. The candidate speaking in front of construction workers signals economic populism. The candidate eating at a local diner signals reliability. The candidate standing in front of soldiers signals strength. The candidate appearing with celebrities signals cultural legitimacy. This is why campaign photography matters so much. Every image tells a political story. Even clothing matters. You ever notice politicians almost never dress too rich during campaigns? Because the average voter does not want to be ruled by someone who looks like they own a private island and drinks melted diamonds for breakfast. Even when politicians are incredibly wealthy, they often attempt to visually flatten themselves into normality. Rolled up sleeves, cheap coffee, pickup trucks, factory tours, the occasional awkward attempt at holding a baby. All forms of signaling. And because different groups want different things, politicians often make promises that are difficult or outright impossible to fully reconcile. For example, a politician may promise lower taxes while simultaneously promising massive infrastructure projects, or stronger border enforcement while promising labor stability for industries dependent on immigration, or aggressive environmental reforms while promising low energy prices. Now, sometimes these contradictions exist because governing is genuinely complicated, but often campaigns intentionally avoid discussing trade-offs because trade-offs lose votes. From here, politicians and their campaigners focus on propaganda. When normal people hear the word propaganda, they imagine old war posters or authoritarian governments, but propaganda in modern democracies is usually much softer, more subtle, more psychological. Campaign propaganda today is largely about emotional framing, simplifying complicated problems into emotionally satisfying narratives. Your economic problems are because of them. Your declining quality of life is because of them. Your fears are valid, and I alone could fix them. This is why modern campaigns love slogans. Slogans bypass detailed analysis and go directly into emotional memory. Hope and change. Build back better. Make America great again. Short, memorable, emotionally loaded, and broad enough that millions of people can project their own desires onto them. Now combine this with modern technology and things get even crazier. Campaigns now use voter databases containing massive amounts of behavioral information. What issues you care about, what ads you respond to, what demographic groups you belong to, what neighborhood votes consistently, what topics trigger engagement. Political advertisements can now be micro-targeted to specific groups, meaning two people living in the same city may receive completely different political messaging from the exact same candidate. One voter may see ads about crime, another sees ads about healthcare, another sees ads about popular, another sees about patriotisms, and another about student debt. The candidate becomes politically modular, while like a Build-A-Bear for ideological preferences. And social media only intensifies this process because outrage spreads faster than nuance. A calm policy explanation gets 14 likes. A politician yelling about the collapse of civilization gets 12 million views and a podcast appearance. So what happens after the election? Now eventually, the campaign ends, the speeches stop, and the ads disappear. The signs slowly decay on random highways, and the governing begins, which is where reality shows up with a baseball bat. Because many promises collide with bureaucracy, congressional opposition, court rulings, budget limitations, lobbying pressures, international events, economic downturns, and simply the fact that large societies are complicated. This is why voters often feel betrayed. The campaign version of politicians and the governing version of politicians are sometimes completely different people. And in fairness, sometimes politicians knowingly overpromise, but other times the structure itself incentivizes unrealistic promises. Imagine if during a campaign a politician says, "Ladies and gentlemen, my plan is moderately effective, economically constrained, politically difficult, and will probably take 12 years to show measurable results. The man is losing by 37 points. Campaigns reward emotional certainty, not realistic expectations. And because election cycles never truly end, politicians often continue campaigning even while in office. Constant media appearances, constant messaging, constant symbolic gestures, constant conflict. Modern politics has essentially become permanent advertisings. At the end of the day, politicians promise everything because the system rewards people who can become symbols for as many groups as possible. Campaigns are not merely contests of policies. They are contests of storytelling, or branding, or emotional identification. The successful politician is often not the person with the best solutions. It is the person who best understands how to emotionally align themselves with the frustrations, hopes, fears, and identities of millions of people at once. And in a country as large, divided, and economically unequal as the United States, that often requires saying different things to different groups. Sometimes strategically, sometimes dishonestly, sometimes because the problems themselves are generally contradictory. But regardless of intention, one thing remains true. Every election season, millions of Americans will once again gather around televisions, phones, rallies, podcasts, and social media feeds to watch wealthy, ambitious human beings in suits promise them a better future. And for at least a few months, everyone will pretend to believe it. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.